Olá, olá, pessoal, muito bom dia. Agradeço muito a presença de todos. Eu sou Fernanda Manhota, Senior Fellow do nosso programa de América do Norte aqui no CEBRI, e gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todos que nos acompanham e prestigiam em mais um evento organizado por nós nessa reta final de 2024. Nesse momento, eu vou transicionar aqui a nossa apresentação para o inglês, que é a língua oficial desse evento, mas convido a todos a permanecer conosco e acompanhar essa sessão, que é o lançamento do nosso dossiê entre Brasil e Estados Unidos no contexto de uma cooperação no G20. So, hello everybody, welcome. I would like to thank you so much for being here with us. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all. My name is Fernanda. I am the Senior Fellow of the North American program here at CEBRI. I'm very happy that we could manage to organize this event. This is such a special event, so we could put together many experts, people that we all admire so much, that we follow their works, and together we're launching here the dossier about Brazil-US collaboration in the context of G20 cooperation. So first of all, and on behalf of CEBRI, I would like to thank you all for making space for this event, our guests here, our collaborators. We have many nice, amazing institutions that are partners of CEBRI and those that we want to be more and more close in the next year. So it's a very special moment to us. I would like to recognize here in the audience many of our people from the board, especially our president, José Pio. I'm very happy that he could join us today. And also would like to mention all the institutions represented here that will be part of our discussion this morning. We have Professor Peter Haken, who is the President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. We also have Jeremy Martin, Vice President of the Energy and Sustainability Program at the Institute of Americas. We have Sarang Shidor, Director of the Global South Program at the Quincy Institute. We have Valentino Sader, Deputy Director for the Adrienne Arsh Latin America Center for the Atlantic Council. We have Nidhi Uphidaya, Deputy Director of Global Policy and Finance at Climate Resilience Center. We have Henry Zimmer, Associate Fellow with the Americas Program at the CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. And sure, we have Luisa Duarte, the Global Fellow at the Wilson Center Brazil Institute. Many of the other authors, they are not here, but they are all represented here. This is, as I told you in the beginning, a launch of a very special document, about 50-page document that we could put together. It was an initiative of CEBRI in the context of the Brazilian G20 presidency here in Brazil. And the idea is to it was at the time to select some specific areas, strategic areas in which Brazil and US could collaborate and go ahead in their partnership. And because of that, we invited these partners so they could share their ideas, their thoughts about how in the future this collaboration could happen. So the idea is to have a document that is not just important to give context, but also to provide information and insights for policy making. And that's the idea. We're sending this document to the authorities here in Brazil, they're responsible for the decision-making process, and we're going to make sure that they can read it and make the best of it. And as I told you, the idea is to go ahead with this and have as the first of many other deliverables that maybe this partnership can have in the next year. So again, thank you all for participating in this nice project. It was a very productive and very insightful project. And also for the audience who is here joining us today, I hope you will have a very nice morning with great ideas and who knows, some possibilities of cooperation in the future. So I'll start by giving you basic instructions. So we're having about 10 minutes for each of the participants so they can share what's the main idea they discuss in their papers that are part of the dossier. And then we have a session for Q&A. So you at the audience, if you want to make questions to any of our participants, please feel free. You can at any time address your questions through the chat. And we have our team here, our staff, managing the questions, and then we're going to answer them all. So thank you so much again. And I'll start following the structure of the document by Professor Peter Haking, who gave us a very, very nice introduction to our dossier, reflecting about the role of Brazil and US in this specific moment of their history, considering, Professor, that this is a special year for our countries, because besides the G20, of course, we had the bicentennial year. The 2024 year was a bicentennial year for us. And also, of course, we had the elections in the US. That will have a huge impact in Brazil in the near future. So please, I give you the floor. I thank you so much for your participation, and I'm very, very anxious to hear your thoughts again. I think your microphone is off, Professor.
I want to thank you and the others at CEBRI for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Unfortunately, I haven't been in Brazil very recently, but this is a nice substitute at least. Let me say, I'm not sure that I'm just the right person to have been drafted to provide the inaugural presentation here. Why? Because I think, well, first of all, I've read through all the other reports, and they're really excellent, and you've really chosen a really exceptional group of people, and I think they're worth reading, and I'm going to go back to them again and take advantage of them. But they are all focused on precisely what you said. What can the US and Brazil do together to begin to deal with certain problems and opportunities? I'm more pessimistic than most of the other writers, I think. There were a few that showed some pessimism too, but I was a little bit more. And my focus has been largely on why has Brazil for so many years, and the United States for so many years, been unable to really find a basis for a long-term cooperation. And whether looking back at where that hasn't happened, what can we say about what might happen now? In any event, what is clear, I think, and is there have been a lot of missed opportunities. That it wasn't that somehow Brazil and the United States didn't get along. In contrary, they've been pretty good friends over the years. And for many years, and I'm not sure what it is today, Brazil was seen as the country in Latin America who was most friendly to the United States. So it was certainly not an absence of will, but there was just not a cooperation. And I mean, the most important was really the first opportunity following the end of the Cold War. What happened? Let me, because we only have a short period, that in 1993, the US brought Mexico into a free trade agreement and organized the first Summit of the Americas for the following year. And the idea, the central objective of the Summit of the Americas was to create the basis for a free trade agreement among the countries of the Americas. And there was considerable enthusiasm for that. One can go back and look at sort of the newspaper reports from almost every country, and everybody was talking and the meeting of the summit, actually, they put the United States and Brazil as the two leading countries on this, the two primary leaders who would sort of see this through. So, and must say that the Brazilians were a little bit reluctant to really endorse all this, but they agreed to share the direction of the program. Well, to make a long story short, I go now to no, it was 6 years later in 2001 when there was the third Summit of the Americas, and Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was still president of Brazil at the time, he was there, I think this was his sixth or seventh year of presidency, and he gave a long speech in Canada where the summit was about why this was not a very constructive or well-constructed agreement, and thought that it was going to be difficult to find a real solution to the problems. And in the end, 5 years later, in the fourth Summit of the Americas, basically Lula da Silva was president and essentially ended the negotiations and the possibility of building this inter-American free trade area. And it was interesting because it showed the sort of distance between Brazil and the United States on what was perhaps the key issue in the relationship at the time. But what's interesting, George Bush, who was president of the United States at the time, was in Argentina where the summit was being held. And he walked out of the meeting after giving an appeal to keep negotiations going and failing. He walked out of the meeting, and you know where he went? To Brazil. Why did he go to Brazil? Because there was awaiting him a barbecue that Lula had prepared for him to join in. And well, it was interesting. That's why I sort of have emphasized the friendship. I mean, here was they were totally at odds in the Summit of the Americas, but George Bush comes to a barbecue in Sao Paulo with Lula da Silva. And you know where Lula da Silva travels right after the barbecue? To meet with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So, I mean, this is, let me go quickly. I don't know how much time I have left now. Basically, there was a trip by Barack Obama, who was a great admirer of Lula da Silva. George Bush may have been a better friend, but Obama was a great admirer, and he brought 50 CEOs from the United States to come to Brazil, and they met. He also brought his wife and two children. They also met with about, I was told, 400 Brazilian CEOs for a day-long discussion. And this all looked, Obama sort of said that he was doing this for building new jobs for Americans, for creating a new economic opportunities for the US and Brazil. And, you know, it was like a great event, a great day at the beach. You know what happens? You have a great day, you get the sun and the water and the sand, And what happens the next day? You come to the beach early in the morning, and there's nothing there. And that's basically what happened. And then we can go through, of course, you had the possibility of a relationship between Mr. Trump and Bolsonaro, the then President Bolsonaro, when he became president. Again, there was sort of a lot of talk about camaraderie, the Trump of the tropics, etc. And they sort of toward the end of the Trump presidency, they had a big meeting with Bolsonaro and much of his cabinet, and had a trade negotiation. And they came to a conclusion, and it was that they would continue negotiating. And that was the end of that person. And then we can go on to the Biden area. Biden's probably his, and I'll end with this. Biden probably the most important initiative that Biden took in Latin America was precisely during the pre-election period of Brazil, when Bolsonaro was competing against Lula da Silva. And there was concern in Washington, and I gather there was also concern in Brazil, that somehow the outcome wouldn't be accepted by everyone in Brazil. And the United States began to send very senior people, including the leader of the Pentagon, the head of the State Department, key senior intelligence officers, and many other delegations of senior, but not quite at the top people, to talk to the Brazilian military more than anything, and make one strong plea: stay out of the election. They didn't say who they should vote for. Stay out of the election. And most of the Brazilian officers did stay out. Quite a few didn't. But the election took place and was pursued democratically and all. And everyone thought that this was maybe the basis for a stronger opportunity. And what happened? Well, Lula did show up in Washington shortly after being elected, within a little more than a month, I think it was, 40 days or so, and was well greeted and all. But then, as one of his next visits was to China, and brought the whole cabinet. Every person in the cabinet went to China, and they arrived. There was a state visit with all the trappings and all the bright lights of a state visit, and it just and right now there's one opportunity for collaboration that I see close is on Venezuela, that the two countries have begun to come together from rather different points of view. They have different points of view. And the one thing that brings them together, which could bring them together, is simply they both have very strong interests in sort of the outcome of politics and government in Venezuela. Not that they sort of have a natural cooperation. This would be one of the first cooperations, but that they both have a strong interest, and that's not existing elsewhere in the portfolio of Brazil or the United States. thank you very much for this opportunity.
Professor Peter, thank you so much. You're so, British in the in the use of your time. So impressive. Thank you so much for this presentation. As I was telling you at the audience, Professor Peter Haking was the responsible for the introduction, the context of our dossier. The chapter that he wrote is called "Friends, Not Allies: Brazil and the United States." So I invite you all then to read the full version of the document. And as you can see by the title, Professor Haking is very good in quoting. He's a very good person for naming things. And I remember, Professor Peter, that in 2016, you wrote a OPAD for Estadão here in Sao Paulo. And till nowadays, almost 10 years later, I'm still using your sentence. I have here, I separated to tell you. You said in 2016 that the bilateral relations at that time still involves sporadic policies without a clear target and often linked to urgent or problematic situations. So you're pessimistic 10 years later, and as we can see, nothing much has changed. But I separated here because I think every time I have to write something about Brazil-US, I remember this quote of yours and a quote of Professor Lowenthal, who said that it's always about security risks in the region. So I think this new chapter that we have here at the dossier gives us a fresh approach to that, even if the situation hasn't changed so much. So it's a very nice text. I really recommend you all to read the piece that Professor Haking wrote for us here. And with no further delay, I'm passing now to our next contributors here. We have, besides the introduction that was written by Professor Haking, other 5 chapters more specifically oriented to areas in which the cooperation can be very strategic. And the first of them is related to climate change. So we made a question to our partners and we provoked them to answer that. And the question that was sent to Valentina Sader and Ms. Nidhi Updaya at the Atlantic Council was: how can Brazil and the US cooperate to address climate change and promote sustainable development within the G20? So the idea here is to hear a little bit about climate change and sustainable development. And for that, I give the floor for these amazing ladies that are also friends. So thank you so much for being part of this. I'm very proud that we made it. And please, you have now your 10 minutes to share a little bit more about how you see this specific subject in the near future for our countries.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you, CEBRI, for the invitation, Laura as well, and Nidhi, my co-author here, for the partnership. It's I think a hard question to answer, especially in the current context that we have. And I couldn't agree more with Professor Peter about the friends, not allies. And I think this is something that we, working with U.S.-Brazil relations here in Washington, see on a daily basis. Fernanda, you mentioned at the beginning that the U.S. and Brazil celebrated 200 years of diplomatic relations this year. And I think that this goes to show that also, especially including in the climate space, there is always ongoing technical cooperation that exists and continues beyond administrations. And I think that for the sake of our theme, I think it's important to highlight. Within the G20, there is an opportunity through engagement groups in particular, especially the private sector, to continue fostering this collaboration on climate. And here, obviously, we need to take into consideration the current context. And Nidhi and I wrote thinking about the two potential outcomes that we could see within the U.S. election, the U.S. presidential election. And still, we believe that there are 3 main areas in which Brazil and the United States could collaborate and should leverage their respective presidencies of COP30 in 2025 that Brazil will host, and then within the G20 in 2026 that the United States will host, toward global action in terms of climate adaptation, energy transition, and technological advancements for a nature-based solution. I think that those are some of the three areas that are important for us to highlight, especially because both the US and Brazil are either suffering with some of these consequences, and there are security concerns here, like we were mentioning, that I think are important for us to take into consideration as we approach some of these areas. Nidhi, I'll turn it over to you for us to kick off with the first point that we raised.
Thank you, Valentina, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, CEBRI, for inviting and for organizing this important discussion, especially after such an eventful year, not just for Brazil and the US, but for the whole world in terms of climate. So the first thing that we focused on was climate adaptation. We're seeing with every passing year that climate events are worsening, and there's an increasing need for climate adaptation. I don't think this is a time for standalone solutions or to think of this as a future event. It is a necessity right now, and it is a necessity to adapt to the changing climate across ecosystems. So in this paper, especially keeping in mind the devastating events that we've seen in 2024 on climate and how it paralyzes economies and systems across countries. And we've seen that very, very clearly in Brazil and the US, both countries. So in the paper, we highlighted three main points that we would like to see for climate adaptation between the two countries. One is prioritizing strategic adaptation and resilience investment plans with a focus on engaging the private sector, creating an enabling policy environment for adaptation solutions to be internalized into existing systems, and ensuring that adaptation finance through the private finance sector, which includes insurers, banks, investors, development banks, and other sources, is efficiently and equitably allocated to build resilient communities and economies. We always talk about mobilizing investments, but along with mobilizing investments, it's very, very critical to make sure that the investments are reaching the right communities, the right people, the right areas of an economy to keep it stable moving forward. I think with the priorities that were highlighted in the G20 process and the priorities expressed in the lead up to COP30, we as a community of think tanks, practitioners, private sector players, multilateral development banks, all of us have a role to play and a massive opportunity to mobilize these investments for building resilience in both countries, which includes implementing solutions, but also scaling existing solutions that are working, so learning from each other. Additionally, we will need to create an enabling policy environment, so understanding what that means for the private sector engagement to actually implement solutions. What does it mean to have a policy environment that will allow for that change to happen rapidly? Because as we all know, there is no time. It's happening. It's all happening right now. Thank you for the opportunity, Val. I'll turn back to you.
And then the other point that we raised, and I will let Jeremy go deeper into it because I know that his piece is particularly on energy, but was energy transition. And the US and Brazil are major energy producers, but also energy consumers. And this is something that is very important for us to consider as tangible potential for cooperation between both countries when it comes to diversifying both countries' energy sources and ensure that their respective sustainable energy security. So I think that this is something for us to maintain as a topic, as a particular theme that will be advantageous for both countries to cooperate on. And biofuels obviously come to mind, and sustainable aviation fuels in Brazil are a very hot topic at the moment. And it also touches on a few topics that we consider today and as part of this dossier, including, climate in terms of land usage as well, and many others. Which brings me to the importance of also curbing deforestation. And beyond the US-Brazil relationship, this is a key point for Brazil's leading role in the climate arena, especially as it prepares to host COP30 next year. The US has a lot to contribute in terms of technology sharing with Brazil that could aid the country in curbing deforestation. And I think that this is also another important key point there for cooperation. Both countries obviously also have the potential within the G20 to drive parallel conversations to COP discussions about financing of nature-based solutions. And here again, the private finance sector and the multilateral development banks are key. And Nidhi will talk further about this, but I think that this is also another point that as we think and as we hear a lot of the Brazilian government officials actually coming to Washington, discussing these issues and actually calling for the US to support, especially on this exchange of technology, of know-how, and of ideas. And I think that this is something that both countries can benefit from. Nidhi, over to you for nature-based finance solutions.
Thank you, Valentina. I think building on the point I was making earlier of how we need to engage with multiple stakeholders for climate adaptation, I think nature-based solutions and forests is something that the private finance sector is actively looking into. This was a key theme and a key discussion point, and there was a lot of interest at this year's COP16, which was the biodiversity COP held in Colombia, and there were a lot of discussions on innovative solutions. The private finance sector is ready to implement these solutions. I think what is needed is a common language around nature-based solutions and investing and mobilizing investments for forests and the bioeconomy. And I think that's where we can mobilize a lot of collaboration between the US and Brazil, with a lot of learnings between the solutions that are implemented. And we need, again, I'm going to keep stressing this because we don't have time. So we need this rapid engagement where solutions are already being implemented. The private finance sector in both countries are already thinking about this. What do we need to do to actually push for it? What sort of metrics, data, taxonomies do we need to be put into place for now? But also, I know these are good discussions that are going to happen in the lead up to COP30, which is going to be the Nature COP.
So I guess a little bit more optimistic than many might think, especially on an issue that is so, sometimes considered a little bit political. But in that sense, I think that there is an opportunity here for both the US and Brazil to leverage other areas of cooperation and other partners within their partnership beyond just government to government and president to president. So I think that, considering the private sector, consider even the legislatives and congressional representatives, I think those are some of the areas where I would anticipate a little bit more depth in terms of the relationship and opportunity to move climate adaptation, energy transition, and deforestation, financing for deforestation forward. Fernanda, back to you.
Thank you, Valentina and Nidhi. It was a very amazing and interactive presentation with lots of things that we can discuss later. I would like to thank you so much for your contribution here. Also would like to remember the audience that we have the opportunity of making questions, so please use the Q&A session to address your questions. We're going to answer them by the end of the event. And also, it's available in the chat, the link that give you the opportunity to access the full dossier. So we're launching here a document. It's a 50-page long document with all the articles and the pieces, the papers that were published by our experts here. So it is available online and it's for free. So please, we invite you to read them, and we're going to be very happy to receive your feedbacks and comments later by CEBRI and to share there with our dear partners here from the different institutions. Now I'm turning to Anne Zimmer, who wrote together within my dear friend Ryan Berg from CSIS, a piece about Brazil and US in the context of the cooperation for global governance and how we can shape the future through institutions. So the paper is named Calibrating Expectations for Positive U.S.-Brazil Dialogue at the G20. And thank you so much for coming. I'm very happy that we could manage this. And please, you have the floor. We're very happy to hear you now.
Thank you so much for hosting me. And thank you to CEBRI for this amazing initiative. I am so thrilled to be on such an esteemed panel with all these experts talking about such a diversity of issues. I also want to thank my co-author, Ryan Berg, who is unfortunately not able to make it to this event, but sends his regards and echoes my appreciation for the opportunity. I want to begin my remarks by doing sort of a retrospective on the G20 and sharing at least what, in my opinion, is the view from Washington of the key takeaway, which is sort of between the G20 and APEC held in Peru just before, China is on the rise in the global south and the United States is nowhere to be found, is the message. And that's a message that I would say is in neither Brazil nor the United States' best interests. It's what neither country wanted the headline to be from this summit. Brazil obviously was looking for the G20 as an opportunity to showcase its global leadership. Lula has been very active in bringing Brazil back to the world stage, making it accepted international fora now. And the United States, of course, does not want to be seen as absent or failing to live up, failing to compete effectively in the global South. So I should say that maybe within this overall negative media malaise, there's actually an opportunity for more Brazil-US collaboration. Both countries didn't quite get what they wanted out of the G20, and there's room to push forward a more positive agenda. So with that in mind, I think that the challenge Brian and I tried to grapple with when we were putting together this, when we were trying to put together our article, is how do you be both realistic about the potential for Brazil-US dialogue at the G20? I'm thinking very strongly of Peter's excellent article talking about friends, not allies. I think we echo that sentiment, that the relationship has always usually been friendly, but has been sporadic and crisis-driven in terms of how Brazil and the United States cooperate on key issues. So how do you have realistic expectations while still pursuing a ambitious and meaningful policy agenda, not doing what we call, not just relying on what we call desserts, which are small, but ultimately not necessarily changing the temperature, changing the needle on the key issues of our day. These sort of small things that often get agreed to in lieu of larger structural and strategic priorities. So again, with that in mind, we decided to call our piece "Calibrating Expectations," and we put forward what I think is both a ambitious but ultimately very realistic proposal that now is possibly the best moment in recent history for Brazil to pursue UN Security Council reform, and that this has been a diplomatic North Star for Brazil since basically the inception of the United Nations. That Brazil was the only country in Latin America and South America to send troops to fight in Europe in World War II. Famously, FDR and Getulio Vargas spoke about how FDR wanted to incorporate Brazil into the post-World War II international order, get Brazil a seat at the table, and then ultimately the Bretton Woods Agreement and the United Nations excluded Brazil from these opportunities. And that this idea, this understanding of being present at the founding, but ultimately excluded, I think remains a key issue that needs to be addressed and sort of a thorn in the side of Brazil-US relations. So we say, all right, now is time. The global South is on the rise. Brazil is a leader in the global South. Brazil is the largest economy in South America. It is respected internationally. It is hosting the G20. It has the sort of bona fides to play a productive role in a future G20 or in a future United Nations Security Council. It's time to open the floor, open up more seats at the table. But in order to do that, Brazil also needs to show that it is capable of working together with a variety of countries on delivering global public goods. What do we mean by that? What we basically mean is that currently the international order is at significant risk. The multilateral order institutions seem like they are failing. There's a strong push, in my opinion, for countries to turn inwards and to focus only on relations with like-minded allies. We see this in the United States, deprioritizing things like the UN, even the G20, focusing on the G7, focusing on the Quad, focusing on the trilateral security agreement with the United Kingdom and Australia on AUKUS. There's a tendency to look, instead of these forums where you actually have to deal with countries that don't share your opinions, there's a tendency to say, all right, we're not going to do that. Those forums don't work. The conflicts in the quagmire in Russia and Ukraine, the lack of consensus on that, the lack of consensus on what to do about China's advances in the global south, that this lack of consensus means that we should not even bother with multilateral institutions. So if Brazil wants to meaningfully reform the architecture of agencies like the United Nations, the UN Security Council, it needs to show that it's capable of making those institutions more efficient and delivering on solutions to some of the greatest challenges that we're facing. So with that in mind, with that sort of overarching, I would say, ambitious goal, we try and outline 3 areas where Brazil and the United States can practically cooperate to show that Brazil is delivering on these global public goods. The first area was covered very superbly by my colleagues Nidhi and Valentina in their previous presentation. It's on climate change and climate adaptation. Both the Brazil and the United States headed into the G20 ravaged by natural disasters. Brazil with obviously the Rio Grande do Sul floods, and the United States with 2 devastating hurricanes, Helene and Milton, that had ravaged it just months before. So both countries have a strong desire to acknowledge the reality of climate change and to work on resilience. I'm not going to dwell too long on that particular point. The second area of sort of proximate collaboration, and I feel like I have lucked out with the news this week, but it's EU-Mercosur and cooperation on getting a deal to the finish line. This is both important for opening up one of the 2 of the largest markets, opening up a relatively closed market in South America. And it's also important for counterbalancing against China. That's obviously a US interest, but I also think it's in Brazil's interest to not be seen as falling completely or becoming completely reliant on China as a trading partner. So getting that to the finish line would be a strong, I would say, diplomatic goal and an under-acknowledged diplomatic goal from Washington's perspective. Closer US-Brazil cooperation could be a really productive avenue for getting EU-Mercosur to the finish line. The final area that we talk about is peacekeeping. Brazil has had a very strong presence in peacekeeping missions historically. Obviously, they led the UN stabilization mission in Haiti, which has received tremendous criticism, and I think might have chastened Brazil on its desire to contribute to multinational peacekeeping efforts. But Brazil is still leading the mission, the MONUSCO mission in Congo. So Brazil has a lot of expertise. Its peacekeeping school is recognized as one of the best in the world for training peacekeepers, and that's an area where, as we face rising levels of global insecurity and fragility, Brazil can actually play a meaningful role in providing stability and helping to keep the peace. So, and I should add, as sort of an aside about my own background, I focus on military modernization efforts extensively in Latin America. President Lula's growth acceleration program has seen Brazil take a close eye at what its armed forces need to modernize. I think that there are some significant synergies you can see with Brazil playing a greater role in regional stability and addressing regional security challenges, in addition to multinational security challenges with peacekeeping, as part of this overall modernization program. And then I'm going to take sort of the speaker's privilege to outline one final area of collaboration, which was not in our paper, but which, following the G20 leaders' statement, I think is increasingly important, and that's on AI, something that we often talk about AI in the context of US-China competition, or very distantly the EU. AI innovation adaptation in the global south is virtually non-existent in the conversation, the international conversation, I should say. And it's an area where Brazil, with its robust digital public infrastructure, which will be talked about later in this presentation, I know, by another of my colleagues, Brazil is really well positioned for that. It has an innovative tech sector. It has the greatest number of unicorns, companies valued at over $1 billion throughout Latin America. And it's an area where the United States, I think, could become really the leader in helping providing technical assistance, training, awareness, helping AI innovation, adaptation in the global South. That's would be my final area that I would highlight for productive U.S.-Brazil cooperation on the road to an eventual Security Council permanent membership for Brazil. How these all evolve in the next, in the coming 4 years remains to be seen. But I do see that I'm at time, and so I'm going to leave you all on something of a cliffhanger. But hope that you enjoy, and I hope that you read the piece and read all the other authors. Thank you again.
Thank you, Henry. Maybe we can, launch this idea here. Every year we can have a report following that to see how it's evolving, maybe. But it was such a great presentation. I was trying to organize here a list of areas in which we can find opportunities, and the list is going very long. So we started by bilateral opportunities, as Peter Haking mentioned, Venezuela. Then we went to the environmental arena with Valentina and Needy talking about adaptation, energy transition, deforestation. Now we're getting to the multilateral issues, such as the reform of UN Security Council, and also technology, which will be addressed again later when we talk also about digital inclusion. So we're getting deeper. So it was so good to hear you. And now I would like to give the floor to our friend Jeremy Martin, who is here representing the Institute of the Americas, and co-authored a piece with Stephanie Ors that is named "How Can Brazil and the U.S. Cooperate to Promote Energy Transitions Within the G20?" So going back to what Vali was mentioning before, we have a chance now with Jeremy to go a little bit more on energy. So Jeremy, thank you so much for this partnership. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fernanda, very much. Everyone at CEBRI, despite the fact that you so rudely got me out of bed here. It's 5 a.m. We're just thereafter in California, but it is great, and I'm delighted to get up so early and join so many friends and colleagues from this, like you mentioned at the outset, amazing roster of think tanks, just so fantastic. And of course, I want to emphasize that the Institute of the Americas, proud and honored we are to collaborate with CEBRI. I'll be in Rio, as a matter of fact, next week. We have a joint event on Rio energy integration on Wednesday afternoon in Rio de Janeiro together. The CEBRI Energy Program, the Institute of the Americas Energy Program. It's been an amazing collaboration, and of course, this contribution to the dossier is one more facet of that. So thanks for that, and thanks for recognizing my co-author, Stephanie Oroz, who couldn't be here, but definitely was super important in the development of the document. Let me just quickly give you the outline of the document. I'm going to go just touch a couple of points on each aspect. About as everyone knows, that the full document is available. I commend on reading the entire document. It is amazing, as you've heard so far from the highlights of my. We thought it was important in our document, and there's 6 parts that we elaborated in the paper, or the contribution that we made for this document pertaining to energy transition and collaboration between Brazil and the United States. So we thought, well, let me just the six parts or the outline are. And we introduced the document with the context, the domestic context, both Brazil and the United States, around energy transition. And then we also looked at renewables and grid modernization, mobilizing private sector in finance and funding. Amazing topic of energy access and just transition. Of course, as noted earlier by colleague council, the role of advanced and alternative biofuels, and then just a summary or conclusion. And we began with the context of the U.S.-Brazil domestic agenda, because I think there's so much to look at. And if we just go to early October, when the U.S.-Brazil Forum, which was founded a few years ago. And at the third ministerial meeting that happened, U.S. Secretary Granholm and Brazil's Minister of Mines and Energy, Silveira, emphasized the ongoing collaboration between our two nations, between Brazil and the United States, to promote clean energy initiatives, emphasizing and redoubling the country's commitments to net zero by 2050. And why we wanted to begin with domestic context is because in both countries, there so much legislation, so many important bills and legal and regulatory frameworks advanced over the last several years. And as part of the U.S.-Brazil Energy Forum, those were celebrated and continue to be emphasized as key areas of alignment between the countries. So you have things like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Brazil's Low Emission Hydrocarbon Law, the Distributed Generation Fuels Policy Renovável, and the New Fuel of the Future Law, the relatively new Fuel of the Future Law. So the point is that in the context, both nations, domestically, of course, through this formalized U.S. BEF, as it's known in a great acronym, are indeed pursuing joint initiatives around so many of these energy transition areas. But moving to some more specific after the context, we looked at the issues of renewables and grid modernization, and just to sort of highlight. Again, we all recognize the climate threat. We all recognize the imperative of climate change and why that's driving so much policy around energy transition, and why those kinds of laws and regulations I just noted in both countries have come to fruition. The fact is, Paris Agreement has very clear objectives, but also when you look at IRENA or IEA, any of the agencies or international bodies that are setting forward reviews and analysis of sort of where we are on the path to reducing global warming. Tripling renewable energy power capacity seems to be part of a key aspect. And so again, that is an area where Brazil and the US domestically, and of course together, have emphasized just exactly why that's so important in how they can leverage that at the global, particularly in such a setting as the G20. But the thing we emphasize in this is, yes, those are key aspects, and yes, we all have a general consensus around, but also important in that is grid modernization and the ability to integrate renewable energy to have a more resilient grid, improving reliability, aspects of smart grid. Energy storage technologies are vital. The renewables come with very clear challenges around intermittence. Those can be ameliorated by technology such as energy storage. So we talked about that, and particularly how both countries and then at the global level, we can look at enabling a more flexible energy system. And again, just to emphasize, there are laws in both countries that can be leveraged. For example, Brazil's new distributed energy generation law, the framework that's created has led to explosive growth in distributed generation in Brazil, small-scale renewable energy, solar particularly. Over 26 gigawatts of distributed generation were deployed as of this year. In the United States, I'm sitting here in California. We've had a huge advances in terms of rooftop solar, in terms of distributed generation. But the intermittency factor, some of the issues on our grid and the reliability and resilience of our grid have demanded technological solutions. And to that end, California has been able to deploy an enormous amount, something like 6,600 megawatts of energy storage, that allows for managing and ameliorating those issues around such large-scale deployment of renewable energy into the matrix or into the grid. So pivoting a little bit to something else that we think is super important when you talk about not just Brazil, US, but this issue of fora into global action, global opportunities around mobilizing private sector and funding. And I think this is where in our paper we looked at just how exactly those laws and regulations and what Brazil and the US have been doing can serve as very important case studies for private sector investment in clean and renewable energy sources. And in particular, obviously the US has a very important model in terms of, there's 50 states. We have an enormous distinction across different states and markets in terms of how private sector funding is deployed for energy transition. But coming to Brazil, I want to emphasize something that pioneered years ago and continues to be very relevant for mobilizing private sector funding and mobilizing capital into renewables, into clean energy technologies. And that's the idea of auctions. And the auction process is something that was and continues to be done in Brazil. It promotes competition. It drives down costs, long-term for renewable generation sources. And so I think these are important lessons that can be leveraged in the G20. The amount of capital that both countries and the amount of capital that's been deployed by the private sector. The American Clean Power Association in a recent report talked about 500 in new investments in the United States, new generation in Brazil. So the point is that there is an enormous amount of private sector capital in both countries being harnessed. How do you develop legal and regulatory frameworks and processes that drive and mobilize capital? Of course, you also need beyond these kinds of examples into more innovative financial mechanisms to drive more private capital. And so those are some of the other things we talked about. I think another piece that we looked at, and it's supremely important for Brazil hosting the G20, is the issue of energy access, or what maybe is more broadly understood as a just transition, right? When we talk about the energy transition and this move from a traditional energy system to more renewable, climate-friendly energy system, I think hosting of the G20 this year has allowed for a unique focus on social inclusion with regards to energy transition. Like I said, this concept of a just transition. Making sure that there's a more inclusive transition, and it's not just for the kinds of beneficiaries that have typically benefited, regardless if it's traditional or new energy system. And so again, I think Brazil hosting the G20 this year has, and through all the working groups, really brought to the fore and allowed to emphasize the issue around how much money is flowing and where's that flowing and why is it important that the global South becomes part. And Brazil, but a whole host of other countries around the world are not.
I think Jeremy has some problems in connection issues. Let me see if he... Oh, he's back. Sorry, Jeremy, sorry.
Oh, you lost me?
Yeah, but it was just for 2 seconds, so you're back.
Okay, I thought maybe, okay, yeah, you weren't, okay. No, but just to wrap up, I do want to emphasize the point of has been a great success in both markets. Both countries have surged to become the world's most important biofuels producers and markets. Obviously, we all know about pro-alcohol, the famous energy security measure adopted in the 70s in Brazil that's led to this tremendous innovation and technological development in Brazil around ethanol and flex fuel. But of course, the U.S. too, with not sugarcane, but with corn-based ethanol and biofuels is hugely important. But the point I wanted to make is the alternative biofuels, the advanced next generation biofuels, and that's the Fuel of the Future law in Brazil. And that is where you particularly get into non-food feedstocks, sort of feedstocks that move beyond the sugarcane or corn, as we have in the U.S., as well as soybeans. And so I think this is the important part that we start to see both countries leverage. And again, the G20 provides this opportunity to leverage funding and technology to drive global standards, and sort of, whether you want to call it next generation biofuels, advanced biofuels, moving into things like sustainable aviation fuel, those obvious areas for natural collaboration. So again, just to summarize, I think I rapidly went through some parts of the paper, but the domestic experience, the international collaboration bilaterally, even before the G20, only provides and accentuates just how important Brazil and the U.S. can be in terms of leveraging those experiences for the G20. Obviously, the summit has come and gone, but now moving into the handoff process, and just what it takes to engage a whole multifaceted of stakeholders, from public, private, to NGOs and academia. And so I'll just leave it there. I know I'm out of time, so I'll stay there. And again, that was a very quick summary of a long paper or a long report we did. Thank you again, CEBRI. Thanks so much, Fernanda and team.
Thank you, Jeremy. It was such a great summary, I would say. And again, I encourage you all to read the full document. It is available at the chat and also in CEBRI's website, so you can have a chance to have the full papers. They're all there. And now I would offer the floor to Mr. Sarang Shidor from Quincy Institute, who wrote a very interesting piece as well with a friend of ours, André Pagliarini. And they also discussed a little bit about the collaboration between Brazil and US in terms of global governance and the role of Brazil and US reforming institutions, as CSIS also did. So both institutions answering questions about global governance. Please, Mr. Sarang, thank you so much for your time, and now you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, and thank you so much to CEBRI, as other speakers have also echoed, for this opportunity. I think it's a fantastic idea, and the dossier really brings together diverse expertise areas and I think makes for a very compelling reading. In our focus areas, which is myself and Andre Pagliarini, who is the co-author in this paper, who unfortunately could not participate today because of a scheduling conflict, but he sends his hello, and I will channel his thoughts as much as mine. We really collaborated quite deeply on this, so it's a joint paper. But I sort of want to say at the outset that global governance is a very big area that has been, tackled by many fora, many countries, many bilaterals, many multilaterals. And we are now, of course, in a different, somewhat of a different world from where we were in the 90s. And this reality is also providing a context. Nevertheless, our paper tries to be optimistic, tries to say, where can there be opportunities? Where can there be spaces where the US and Brazil can cooperate? And one caveat here is we wrote this paper a couple of months back when the election was uncertain. And we expected at least a close election. Now that we have a decisive election, I would add a couple of additional points to what is already in the paper to round it up, because we do have President Trump coming back in January, and it will be a somewhat of a different orientation of the United States. So the first thing we hit upon, just like our colleagues did at CSIS, which they were working on independently, but was UNSC reform. UNSC reform is a pressing need, because this is, at the end of the day, we all can find faults with the UN, but it's really the only system that is truly global, truly multilateral, and has stood the test of time at the founding of the new world after World War II. And although the UNSC is paralyzed, many UN agencies continue to do good work. So it's not like the whole of the UN system is dead. The UN actually is functioning. Its core organs, unfortunately, are much weaker than they used to be. How do you revive them? And here I do think that the US and Brazil have more in common than not. The US has long supported the G4 proposal from back in the day, where it was Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India as 4 permanent members. But we have moved on since then a little bit in terms of Africa becoming much more prominent in the global order in the global south, along with, of course, Latin America and Southeast Asia. And there is a need now to think of the UNSC as representing all parts of the global south in a way that's equitable, fair, but also efficacious, delivers. And here, the Quincy Institute has led on a project which we have mentioned and cited in the paper, which is a very large institutional project called the Better Order Project. We brought together 130 former and current government officials. We had 2 workshops in Istanbul. The report is out. It has very detailed, specific proposals on UNSC reform, which we don't have time to go through every element of it. But fundamentally, it calls for 3 new permanent seats and 5 semi-permanent seats. These 3 new permanent seats, 1 from Asia, 1 from Latin America, and 1 from Africa, would round up the representation. But in this process, the smaller powers should not be neglected. And Brazil has had a long history of diplomacy in Africa, for example, under the first Lula period. So Brazil will be a partner in this and trying to bring smaller powers into the UNSC as well. And here, that's why we have created another tier of semi-permanent membership that's drawn from a separate list of countries from the more, let's say, middle power set. To make it more equitable within the Global South, because the Global South itself has its own differentials of power, and that needs addressing. We also talk about empowering the UNGA and a charter review every 24 years. Details can be found at the Better Order Project website, where all the proposals are outlined. Then we also looked at some of the burning issues that the Global South, and Brazil has led on this, is advocating, and the US has a national interest in solving. One of them is debt. And one may think that debt is an issue that perhaps a smaller, poorer country has to figure out on its own, or perhaps some countries can help. But this is not about altruism. It's about the global financial order. Because if the debt crisis multiplies, and even creditors are at risk, and the entire global financial system comes under stress. So it's in the interest of the United States to actually help solve it. It's done that with the G20, with the common framework. China has been brought in. The result has been somewhat mixed, but there's a new push necessary on debt relief. We are facing the biggest debt crisis since the early 80s. Latin America is very much implicated in that, as is Africa and some parts of Asia. So there's a real, I think, even under a Trump administration, from the global financial stability standpoint, there's a compelling interest for the United States and Brazil to work together on this issue. We also, as our previous speakers have talked about, we also touched upon climate change. Again, a major issue for Brazil under Lula, perhaps not now going to be cited explicitly in the new US administration, but nevertheless, as Nidhi and Valentina have said, adaptation remains on the table. It's very hard to deny natural disasters, whether you believe climate change comes from one cause or the other. The fact is there are people hurting and properties being damaged, communities being hammered. And here there's a real scope for the US and Brazil. Put aside the contentious issues of climate change, but look at the practicalities of how do you build resilience in the region. Because again, resilience can reduce, from the US perspective, also pressures on natural resources, such as water sharing between the US and Mexico, and migration. So there's a national interest for the US to work on this. Brazil, of course, has led on climate for a number of years. So we do think adaptation is an important area of work, but we also add to that climate security as an important area of work. Now, here there are differences between the Global South and the Global North. The interpretations are different. In the Better Order Project, we looked at climate security, took it on squarely, and proposed a bridge set of proposals that can bring these two parts of the world together in a time when climate disasters are multiplying and their security impacts are very hard to deny. At the same time, the Global South has genuine concerns on climate security being used perhaps as a pretext for interventionist policy. So we need to bring the two sides together. The US and Brazil are very well positioned to act as leaders in this bridging. And so climate security is an area we have talked about. And finally, we have also mentioned the WTO's revival. Now, here it may seem very difficult to achieve with the US leading in industrial policy. China, of course, has long led that approach. And now many countries are saying, why do we need an open system? We can just go back to national interest, period, geostrategy, period, power, period. Rules may not matter so much. Not quite true, because at the end of the day, we all will suffer if everybody just, it's every country for itself. And I think the US also recognizes that somewhere inside. So this is a tough one, but I think there's a need to go back to the WTO, not just unplug the appellate body, which looks difficult to achieve, but think of what it means to have an international trading system. Maybe we need to bring in issues like industrial policy at the heart of a new WTO or reformed WTO, where every country can pursue those within reason, but in a rules-based way, not just in random arbitrary ways. So is there some hope there? I would like to think so, although it's the hardest part of what we have talked about. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Sarang. It was a great presentation. And you mentioned two of the, I think, the hot topics since President Trump got elected to the bilateral relations, tariffs, economy, and of course, immigration. We couldn't cover all that in this report specifically because, of course, as you know, we were all focused on the axis of G20 and the Brazilian presidency, but this is a very good opportunity to announce that in the beginning of 2025, we're going to organize many discussions, events, and also publications about this specific subject. You're all invited to collaborate on that. You're going to hear from us very soon about that. And I see that in the audience, we have also Ambassador Anthony Harrington, who served in Brazil and is very experienced, also suggesting that we discuss in the future immigration and also tariffs on imports. So Ambassador, we're hearing you, and we're going to address this subject in the near future. Thank you so much, Sarang again. And last but not least, let's go to the last panelist of today, Luisa Duarte, who wrote a piece, a very nice piece with Bruna Santos, the director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. The paper addresses a question about cooperation to promote digital inclusion within the G20. So, Luisa, thank you so much for your time. I'm very happy that you're here with us. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you to you, Fernanda and CEBRI, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to join this group of speakers and participants, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to engage with you all today. I also want to acknowledge the co-author of this chapter, Bruna Santos, that could not be here, but send her regards. This dossier presents important advances made in digital policy during this year G20. Both Brazil and US have substantial digital economies that influence global digital policy and drive infrastructure development. Regarding what the US and Brazil can do together, well, this just changed with the last American presidential election results. So I'll be adding new points to what we wrote in the dossier. I'm also a pessimist, so it's maybe not the best that we start with pessimism, and we also end in the same note, following the opening remarks of Professor Henke. So in light of a new Trump administration, I expect the digital cooperation to be significantly impacted. I also share the view that while the next administration may not offer promising prospects for cooperation within the UN, the G20, on the other hand, could be gain relevance and be the preferred forum for international engagement. With the G20, the US and Brazil could advance cooperation in at least two main areas that have already been established: digital inclusion, universal and meaningful connectivity, and digital government and inclusive digital public infrastructure. However, I anticipate significant challenges in advancing cooperation on frameworks such as information integrity and artificial intelligence for inclusive, sustainable development. This year, the G20 Maceió Ministerial Declaration demonstrated that the G20's commitment to digital inclusion and universal meaningful connectivity. The US and Brazil can play a key role in advancing the meaningful digital inclusion with the G20 framework, not only by sustaining and expanding the commitments that were made by this and the previous presidencies on inclusion, sharing best practice, and guidelines on indicators and metrics, but by fostering inclusive financing mechanisms and funding implementation strategies to overcome the digital infrastructure gap. Countries can collaborate to expand broadband development, bringing connectivity to underserved and unserved areas, as well as underrepresented groups, closing the digital divide and reducing inequalities in digital space, including through educational programs focused on digital literacy. I think it's important to include here the work being done by the cities, the G20 cities, in expansion broadband deployment also. Last year, G20 members committed to cutting the gender digital divide in half by 2030. So progress on this agenda could still be possible, even though this is likely not a priority for the next administration. Data access and data sharing solutions are also critical areas of cooperation to promote digital government service and inclusive digital public infrastructure. Countries can work together to align global standards for digital payments and data governance. The Brazilian presidency of the G20 states its views of digital inclusion as a tool for inclusive, sustainable development and inequality reduction, as well as a urgent need that would enable emerging economies to participate in the benefits of digital economic transformation. The G20 2024 frames this digital revolution and climate change as interconnected transitions that can only be addressed through international cooperation. So furthermore, this year, international cooperation on digital policy with the G20 has, for the first time in history and in a year with a record number of elections, incorporated a commitment to combat disinformation. The coming years will be of a profound importance for all the advances in artificial intelligence as well as AI policy globally. So countries are now exploring different regulatory approaches to a technology that is rapidly evolving in terms of its use and capabilities. The 2024 São Luís Declaration on Artificial Intelligence, a joint statement from the G20 engagement groups, make what can be seen as a bold recommendation supporting the UN's AI Advisory Board, establish an international scientific panel on AI, modeled by the IPCC, and advocates that this panel should be based in a global South country, reflecting this committed with a global vision and in intersectional approach. While Trump in the White House, it's anticipated that the U.S. regulatory landscape for technology and communication will shift significantly, and the U.S. and Brazil under Lula will diverge in their respective approaches to social media regulation and AI governance. So cooperation on information integrity and trust in the digital environment, as well as AI governance within the G20, risk being paralyzed in the coming years. Instead, US and Brazil could find opportunities and new frameworks to work together in common grounds to advance cooperation in digital safety, data privacy, and cybersecurity. I will leave it at that and look forward to the discussions I had. I hope I was not that pessimist, but I think is a field that will be particularly impacted.
Thank you, Luisa. It was great. And I think it was a nice way of finishing our presentations of today. As you could see, we have many different areas in which the countries could collaborate. Of course, we have our challenges to face, but I believe that the dossier is not just a very organized way of finding these specific opportunities. They are mapped there, but also it offers as well some suggestions in the approaching. So this is very important, and that's why we're willing to, as a next step, address this document to the Brazilian authorities and the authorities in the US. So we're going to keep you posted on that. But to make our event complete today, we have now a few questions that arrived here during the presentations. We were trying to organize them and to divide them, since we have just 10 minutes. And I would suggest that maybe I have selected here 5 questions, and I would suggest that maybe we can address each one for a different group or a different person, and you answer that in a brief comment so we can make sure that all questions are answered. Is it okay for you all? Okay, so I'll start by Professor Haking. Professor Haking, we have a question specifically addressed for you. It's a question made by Benjamin George. He asks, of course, it is the 1 million question of nowadays. What do you expect for Brazil-US relations in the second Trump administration, since we're here talking about opportunities and challenges? So, of course, the future ahead is something that will impact all the policies we're suggesting here in this discussion, and that we, of course, discussed in the dossier. So what's your feeling about the next Trump administration? That's the first question for you. And then I go to the next one, but let me give the floor to Professor Haking.
Well, that's the question that everybody is asking, and nobody really has a good view. It illustrates the difficulty of predicting anything in this current world.
It is such a difficult question, Professor, and this moderator here wants you to answer in 2 minutes. Can you imagine that?
Well, I'll do my best. Look, if you look at both the Biden administration and the promises and the initiatives that Trump is making, there are certain similarities. One that's very interesting is the increased use of oil and gas that both presidents have used. Clearly, Biden was more committed to dealing with climate change, but the sort of political problems make that very difficult. So I think that we're now going to see sort of a much more stronger engagement in opening up new areas of whether it's energy or oil and gas, etc., just because that's what Trump has been advertising. That's what people are expecting. I think that both Biden and Trump will have little interest in Latin America, aside from Mexico and migration and China. I don't have any idea how they're going to manage the China part of that, simply because, Latin America, South America is more dependent on China now, today, than they are the United States. And the United States has no capacity for pushing funding toward Latin America. There's just that, given the free markets and given the promise to reduce expenditure, very, very difficult to imagine that there's going to be much effort to deal with certainly South America, and probably not much beyond Mexico. Mexico has, a very large portion of U.S. trade and 80% of Mexican trade. I think that the view of Brazil is not going to change very dramatically, and I think both Republicans and Democrats, since the turn of the century and maybe even before, really don't see Brazil as an international actor. They see it as a regional actor. And given that it's a regional actor, and Brazil is less interested in the region than sort of working internationally. The first visits of Lula, for example, now Bolsonaro would be different, but I just don't. I think that Brazil and the United States have different views on what the emphasis regarding Brazil should be. And I can go on, but I probably passed my 2 minutes already, and let me give it to somebody with some greater degree of optimism.
You're amazing. So now we're keeping the topic. Everybody's asking about the future, about Trump, and of course about the topics we discussed in this new moment. So maybe we can turn to Henry. Henry, would you please would you like to add some comments regarding maybe immigration and tariffs on imports or security issues in this bilateral relation under Trump administration? Would you like to discuss a little bit more about that? That's a question made by Ambassador Harrington, as I told you. Of course, we're not going deep on that, but maybe if you want to share some of the discussions you're having at CSIS and how you're seeing that for the future, and then, of course, the impact that we'll have in the multilateral agenda, would like to hear you.
Thank you very much. It's certainly a pressing question, and not one with a whole lot of optimism either. You know, the basic questions that a Trump administration will ask when they're looking at countries in the region are going to be, number one, are they sending us migrants? Number two, are they sending us quote unquote crime? And then second, then below that slightly is, what's our trade balance? What's our trade deficit with them? So in the case of Brazil, migration, Brazil is a net recipient of migration. Obviously, has received significant amounts of Venezuelan migrants. So there's actually, you know, maybe some areas, as Professor Haken talked about, for cooperation on the issue of Venezuela. And addressing the migration crisis there, in sort of light of a broader strategy to address the political crisis in Venezuela. That's maybe the bright spot in the relationship. In terms of crime and transnational criminal organizations, I think there's room for the relationship to go sour, but there's also room for it to be better. And I guess I'll dwell on maybe the optimistic scenario, the bright scenario, which is that I think a Trump administration is going to be much more invested in curbing transnational organized crime. But that's only if countries are able to sort of hit the right notes and talk the right talk about how they want to engage with the United States on security assistance. There's a big risk, in my opinion, that Brazil, under the remaining years of the Lula administration, might not hit those notes for a reason, you know, might be resistant to the allegations that Trump is going to try and paint the region with a broad brush, talk about how, let's say, under his predecessor, it was much tougher, right? You know, Bolsonaro took a tough approach. He made it easier for Brazilians to acquire firearms. He made it easier, you know, he supported the armed forces and the military. And I think that the risk of that souring the relationship from the get-go is significant. But if we're able to get beyond that and focus on sort of the practical cooperation, there's a way out there. And then on trade and tariffs, it's really that's really sort of, I think, the lingering question. The one thing is that Brazil and the United States are already competitors, and actually we partially, maybe because of the long and fraught story of the free trade area of the Americas, we have not taken many measures to lower those trade barriers. So the risk that Trump will come in and completely torpedo the Brazil-U.S. trading relationship, I think, is not super significant. One area I would highlight that we want to look into is critical minerals. I think a Trump administration is going to be much more focused on mining and critical minerals. A lot of that's going to be in the United States, but some of it will definitely be in the Americas. And Brazil is of course a mineral superpower in the Americas. So if there's room to sort of have a more productive exchange on any one sector of the economy, I think that's one area which could also see some synergies in the clean energy transition. So that's a very 35,000-foot view at maybe some of the key issues that the Trump administration is going to be looking into. But I hope that accurately reflects sort of the view from my end.
Thank you so much. Jeremy, I have a question for you. It comes from Claudia Magalhães. She's interested in the future of the initiative on bioeconomy. What do you see and how do you see this initiative that was launched during the Brazilian presidency? We know South Africa, she says, will continue the initiative next year, but considering the new priorities in the presidency of the US in 2025, she would like to have your thoughts on that. So how do you see Trump and the cooperation under bioeconomy specifically?
Wow. So that's a very, very, very specific question, but let me answer it with a very general statement. And that is, I think what both Peter and Henry have said is there will be a very transactional, but more importantly, unpredictable approach to anything, whether that's this specific area, whether that's the other areas that have been talked about with regards to the incoming U.S. administration. So I just don't have a specific answer. I apologize, but I think the fact of the matter is everything will be transactional. It will be what does it mean for the United States, and how does the United States under a Trump administration see itself benefiting? We haven't even confirmed the policymakers, whether it's State Department, whether it's Department of Energy yet. Those, we know who the nominees are. Peter's talked about the much more direct focus on fossil fuels. That includes the new nominee for to take over at EPA. So you could see, again, this is speculative, you could see these kinds of initiatives being very, very much diminished from the perspective of a U.S. leadership role under Trump. But that's, I mean, again, not very helpful, I'm sure, but that's where we are right now.
No, it was very helpful, and we could say that applies to so many areas, Jeremy. So it is so accurate. So the last two questions, I'll address both of them in a row so we can finish on time. The first one is to our team from the Atlantic Council. It was made by Maria Clara Sedney. She asks specifically, Valentina and Dr. Needy as well, about the relationship between mass globalization, the rising of extremistic political conflicts, and climate change. So she's wanting to hear from you about how do you see polarization and changes in political arena within the countries, and how it affects this collaboration in environmental agenda. So if you could elaborate on that, that's what she's asking for. And to finish that, we have a question to Luisa that is not specifically just regarding related to digital inclusion, Luisa, but also in the, doing business among the two countries in general. I know that we at the Wilson Center also discuss a lot of that there. And the question is from Gil Docci. She is saying that sometimes it's difficult to understand where does lack of government support comes from in the US-Brazil relations, and also sometimes it's very difficult to understand why it's too risky or too expensive for the private sector to engage. So she's wondering about how other stakeholders could help to make this collaboration more, profound. So I would like to hear from you as a wrap-up of our session. And since you're, participating in so many high-level discussions at the Wilson Center, what are the reasons that could explain the lack of the stakeholders doing more in DC, and what could be done for that, looking at the future? So these are the last two questions. I'm going back to Valentina and Needy, and then to Luisa.
Thank you. I think it's a hard question to answer, but I think that overall in the world we are seeing backsliding of democratic institutions and democratic principles overall. This is not exclusive to Latin America or to the Western Hemisphere. We're seeing all over the world, and I think that I wrote a piece close to the Brazilian elections in 2022 that actually looked into that, and I think the recommendations there are still relevant. You know, you showcasing democratic the strength of your democracy doesn't mean that your democracy cannot be strengthened. And I think that these are some of the points that we can make here. Now, in terms of how this political polarization might be shifting and affecting climate in particular, I think that this is something that it's what we mentioned. Despite what kind of government you have, it seems to me that climate will be a priority or not regardless, but definitely a need. We mentioned this and others mentioned it during this conversation as well, that there is no denying of the impact of climate change regardless of the causes of it. So I think that this is a priority that will have to be continued throughout the next years and whatever the priorities may be, regardless of administrations. So I think that would be me trying to answer this question. Needy.
Thanks, Valentina. And I think just adding on to it very quickly, that is why the stress on engaging, not just at the government level, but at the different stakeholder level to mobilize some sort of action, because like multiple people have said in this discussion, it's not about climate change as a concept, as a theory, as this high level thing. It's what people are seeing right now of disasters affecting your communities, your businesses, your economy. And that's what governments need to react to, whether democratic or another kind, to keep everything stable. So those are my two thoughts. Thank you.
That's a very good answer, and goes back to Jeremy and the transactional, you know, even if you want to deny reality, it's still a problem you need to deal with. So, Luisa, you have the floor to the last one.
So it's also a question difficult to answer. I do agree that the federal government may lack capacity to support private sector in technology investment and development between the two countries. Maybe one avenue for that would be increased participation of cities and state level to provide this support, juridical support, a financial support, a guidance to make those corporations more frequent, more impactful. But maybe the concentration in Itamaraty of this role is not the best solution, or they're being unable to, they don't have enough arms to support that, or they are trying to expand. We have a newly created AI position inside Itamaraty. I'm following their efforts to identify, first of all, people involved in technology working in the US, like the startups, Brazilian startups in the US, and projects and that are being developed now, and try to connect them and to support them in some way. But this is a very, in my sense, a very initial effort that, of course, has a lot of room to expand and improve. And well, maybe this is an area of cooperation that can see that bring opportunities more than the opposite with technology.
Thank you, Luisa. So I would like to again thank you all so much for your amazing work. It's been such an intense year for all of us who work with US-Brazil relations in general and in think tanks in particular. I couldn't finish this event without mentioning again all the institutions that could make possible this very amazing dossier we produced together. So, of course, CEBRI, I would like to thank you, all the team, the staff, and those who supported the North American program to make this opportunity something big. So on behalf of Ambassador Recupero, who is the leader of our group, our other senior fellows, Maria Hermínia Tavares, Abrão Neto, I would like to say that we are very grateful to CEBRI. We have here the chance to say that specifically to the chairman of the Board of Trustees from CEBRI, José Pio, who is here. So thank you so much. I would also like to recognize, to acknowledge Laura Escudeiro, who is the coordinator of our project, and she's such an amazing person and expert as well. She was fundamental to this initiative. I tell her every day how amazing it is to work with her, and I need to make it public. So Laura, thank you so much for the efforts you moved, and I know how hard you worked for that. And also would like, of course, to thank our partners, our amazing partners. Most of them, have for me a personal bond. I will never forget that CSIS was my first internship in life. So I have very personal bonds to that. I lived in California during my Fulbright period, so Institute of America is part of my memories as well. Professor Peter Haking was, through the Inter-American Dialogue, one of the first experts I ever knew when I was a young researcher. Valentina and the friends from the Atlantic Council, they became like friends, like family to me. Luisa from the Wilson Center, we're together there. We are global fellows working with Bruna so hard. And the same with the Quincy Institute, who were part of our year as well. I am one of the experts they invited to this big project they made. So it's also very personal. I have to make this personal note here. Thank you so much for attending this event. And, Institute of Americas, Wilson Center, Atlantic Council, the Dialogue, CSIS, Quincy Institute, it's such a dream team for those who work with U.S.-Brazil relations. We're so proud to have this together. So thank you again so much for you. I hope it's the first path of a long journey that maybe we can collaborate in the next years. Again, for you at the audience, thank you so much for attending this event. If you couldn't have a chance to read the full dossier, it's available on CEBRI's website and also in the chat. The link goes straight to the document. It's a 47-page document full of great content that we would like to go ahead and discuss more in the future. Again, thank you so much. I hope you have a very great end of the year. Have a great Christmas time if you celebrate Christmas, and a Happy New Year. This is the last event from the North American program, but of course not from CEBRI. If you want to follow what's happening on CEBRI, we still have some things on the calendar, on the schedule, and you're all invited to join us. Thank you so much, and I see you very soon.